It's May 23rd today. On 27th May 1964, Nehru died. 2 days before he died, there were two, or probably a day before he died, he had scribbled a few lines of Robert Frost's poem on his table that he had left. That's typical Nehru, always wanting poetry and loves words. So he had written these lines that said, "I have miles to go before I sleep. I have promises to keep. I have miles to go." Those were the lines that he chose from Robert Wood's poem. And it kind of told us what was on his mind, and it has to be, right? He was ailing for some time, and the question has always been, will Nehru relinquish and appoint a successor? On appointing a successor, he was very clear he was not going to do it. And contrary to what is now often being said, Indira Gandhi was nowhere near the succession, nowhere near. She was a Congress president for 1 year, and actually without much help from Nehru, she became one. He did not stand in her way. By the time 1961 rolled in, he was, Robert Frost, PK. He was pretty ill by 1961 when he went to US for a state visit with Kennedy and his stopover in London. Both British and American authorities were very worried about the health of Nehru. And oftentimes the question came up in the press about who after Nehru. That question irritated him a lot. He always thought he was very athletic. He was an athletic man. He was a very athletic man. And he actually performed yoga. He didn't pose for yoga. He actually performed yoga. He could do the famous headstand. So he was he thought he could carry on for a while. But since 1961, he was in declining health. So often I'm faced with the question of what can I pinpoint as Nehru's mistakes, right? Or what did he do wrong, or what could he have done better? He could have stepped down in 1960. That's a fact. He was very ill. His health was failing him. Practically at that time, T.T. Krishnamachari and two others ran the ministry. And Nehru's involvement in day-to-day affairs were very limited. Shastri was brought back into the cabinet. Shastri had left due to the Kamraj plan, and Shastri had come back. And it was pretty much Shastri who was being lined up as the successor for Nehru, not Indira Gandhi. So the dynasty that we call today was not Nehru's doing. When we talk about Nehru, why is it important today to dismantle Nehru? For example, today Aravindan Neelakantan has written an article claiming that Nehru could be called a racist, whereas out of pure gentlemanliness, he would not do so. That's not true. A recent historian, when they completed his collected works or selected works of Nehru, the remark was you couldn't find any malicious thought in Nehru. The man really was cut from a different cloth. So why is it important to malign Nehru today? That's the question. Because what is standing between the Hindutva idea of India and the realization of that is that the Nehru's idea of India is still lingering in people's mind. There are still people of PAK's generation who were greatly inspired by Nehru. And then there are people down to me and younger than me who still draw inspiration from the lives of Nehru and Gandhi. And their idea of India is distinctly opposed to the Hindutva idea of Gandhi, of India. And that is why they have to show that Nehru was incompetent, Nehru was this, Nehru was that they have to it's not about the demystification or demythologizing of Nehru. If that is done, that is absolutely no problem with that, right? Are there myths about Nehru? Absolutely. Are there myths about Gandhi? Yes. Do we have to demythologize them? Yes. But they want to deconstruct Nehru in such a manner to say that everything that's wrong or perceived as wrong of India today can be traced to the Nehru era. That is not so. And that is why it is important for them to destroy the idea of Nehru. And which is why we find almost a factory of lies that are malingering Nehru. And this also, Nehru has been ill-served by the lack of good biographers and historians. The last reasonable biography of Nehru was Sarvapalli Gopal's trilogy, and that was published somewhere in the 70s. And then there was a very slim volume by M.J. Akbar and an even slimmer volume by Shashi Tharoor. Other than Gopal, the other two are not really historians, and Gopal's credentials of a historian are also only by Indian standards. His biography does not rank anywhere close to David McCullough's biography of Truman, or Ron Chernow's biography of Washington, or the many biographies of Franklin Roosevelt. So this is the kind of problem that we often have. And what is currently more in vogue is people take memoirs. It is M.O. Mathai's memoir. It is, here's a memoir, there's a memoir. Somebody who was anybody in those days has written some memoir. And memoirs are invariably self-serving. But Nehru's autobiography starts with a quote from Abraham Coley saying precisely that. This is an autobiography. I like to say things that glorify me. And to the reader, it may be irritating. And to say anything unflattering to myself will be irritating to me. So the problem is we rely on these memoirs. We catch a phrase here, catch a phrase there. So take this resignation speech of Ambedkar, for example. Ambedkar resigns, I think somewhere around 1951, 30th September or something, he resigns. Essentially 1951, Ambedkar resigns from Nehru's cabinet. And he gives a speech in the parliament. Actually, this is beautiful that Ambedkar does this. And he also outlines as to why he does it. He says, if I leave without a speech or explaining my reasons, tomorrow somebody may claim something and they may impose their views on his resignation. So he was another quintessential person who learned a lot from the West. And he gives like 4 or 5 reasons in his resignation speech. I have seen people quoting that speech and asking, isn't Nehru wrong? Right? And for example, one thing that Ambedkar says is, India spends too much on defense. That was his complaint. Saying, I think going by his figures, it was almost 50% of the revenue was being spent on defense. And remember, he's writing this in 1951, barely 4 years after the independence, when India was still dealing with the partition problem. And the partition problem, the refugees, the unimaginable biblical exodus of human beings, unprecedented in history, meant that India had to spend. There was simply no other way. We did not have a good neighbor. We still don't have good neighbors, whether it is Pakistan or China. India does not have good neighbors. And that's one of our problems. It's a reality. And therefore, we had to spend on defense. That was number one. So if anyone says, oh, well, Ambedkar said this, and also Ambedkar lays a critical charge on the regime, which was, and he was hinting at Nehru's non-alignment, which at that time was still being formulated, still being talked about. Essentially, Nehru was trying to keep India in the middle, outside of the US sphere and outside of the Soviet sphere. And it was driven more by pragmatism than by principle, actually. People don't realize this. Thing is, essentially, India was an impoverished country. We were literally requiring money and help from anyone who can give it. And if we are dependent on anyone who can give it, we are better off staying in the middle lane rather than taking sides. And both the sides, the American and the Soviet sides, were very clear. If you take our money, you got to sign up on the dotted line. That was very clear from both sides. America expected, and this is from a recent historian, and what he said is, America really expected India to sign on the dotted line and be a vassal state. This is an American historian writing recently, right? And Soviet expectation was no less. And did we go through all the freedom struggle to become somebody's vassal again? even if it was nominally a military alliance or any of those things. And of course, Gandhi's spirit was still animating the country. If Nehru had taken India into a military alliance, like Pakistan eagerly signed on to every military alliance they could, India did not. And that was a good move. Now, coming back to the point, right? So 1951, when Ambedkar resigns, that is when actually US starts taking interest in India. When Truman took power after Roosevelt dies in 1945, when Truman took over, the World War was still going on, and then there was the post-war world for Truman to deal with. Literally, the CIA, which was newly established by Truman, draws up a list of priorities for Truman. And South Asia is at the bottom of the list. Western Europe, Africa, Southeast Asia, everything is there. South Asia, India, is at the bottom of the list. This has to be understood. To the power blocks, India did not matter on the global stage. This is important. And there was simply no money ready to be given, particularly for military purposes. The US defense allocation for India was almost zero, and nor was Soviet. And now here is the interesting part about Soviet Russia in 1951. In 1951, Stalin was still alive. And until Stalin dies, pretty much Soviet Russia was keeping a huge distance between themselves and India. If I remember correctly, and since PAK is on the line, he might know this better. When Gandhi died, the only consulate where the condolence book in the Indian embassy that had no note from the country's leadership was in Soviet Russia. Indian embassy in Moscow did not have an entry from Stalin or his cabinet in the condolence book in India's embassy in Moscow. So that's important to be understood, right? So essentially, there was no money coming into India for any purpose whatsoever, militarily or for even the refugee budget and other things, right? So and then if you look at how the relationship thereafter. And even as Ambedkar was leveling this allegation, right, saying you're too aloof, you go through this middle road, you're not getting help from anyone. Meantime, the Korean War had taken place, and India had played a very important role in the Korean War. India, and it is not even India that played, it was Nehru. On the global stage at that time, it was only Nehru who mattered. The prestige that he carried was simply phenomenal, and his grasp of international affairs and his ability to relate with people was just beyond belief. And India was involved with the prisoner swapping arrangements. India contributed to overseeing that process between the People's Republic of China and US. So that was the prestige with which India was at that time. And actually, if US had listened to India a little more, Panikkar, our ambassador in Moscow, was warned by China that they were going to attack in Korea. And it was related to US. But of course, Douglas MacArthur, who was in Korea, simply wouldn't listen. Douglas MacArthur was a megalomaniac himself. And the Truman administration didn't even pay attention to anything that came out of India as intelligence input. And they paid a price for that. The Korean War was devastating to US, and in the middle of that, Truman had to fire a 5-star general, Douglas MacArthur, so it changed it, right? So all this happens by the time Ambedkar resigns. So today, when somebody says, here is Ambedkar's speech, this is the allegation, that is fine. That is what Ambedkar said in 1951. One, what was the circumstance at that time? Did he know better? He didn't, right? Many of this was happening in the background. He was not privy to much of what was happening. He was heading the law ministry. So that was not privy to him, right? And many of this are still being unearthed by historians. That's the important part to be understood. And then that's 1951. Then the scene shifts very rapidly, right? By the time Nehru and Eisenhower had struck a big relationship. Eisenhower loved Nehru, personally. Nehru's first state visit to US was in 1949 during Truman's time, and it was a grand success. And Columbia University, Eisenhower was the dean at Columbia University. He conferred honorary doctorate on Nehru, and Nehru was invited to give the convocation address in Columbia University. So an American Ivy League university invites Nehru to deliver the convocation address in 1949, when, again, remember, India had no strategic or financial clout in those days. It was merely the image of Gandhi's India and the personal standing that Nehru had that gave India a voice on the international arena. That's important to be understood. After 1951, things shift. By this time, Eisenhower comes to power. Eisenhower had seen Nehru. Eisenhower already has a good impression of Nehru. Then the funds start coming. And now, by 1953, Stalin is dead. There is a reset between Soviet Russia and India. And Soviet Russia now sees an opportunity. Khrushchev sees an opportunity in India. They want to counter the West. Essentially, Eisenhower and Khrushchev compete for having their clout in India. Now, somebody is asking about, of course, Kashmir, right? Why Patel advice was not listened by Nehru, that is capturing Kashmir the same way like Andhra Pradesh. One, Andhra Pradesh was landlocked. And we had a bigger justification in capturing Andhra than we had in capturing Kashmir. So it's not like Nehru or Patel ran away with their ideas. That's important, right? It's not like, and every idea was not worth pursuing. And Pakistan was really putting up a fight. And how far could we afford that fight? Because the other person had asked Andhra, that's why I'm sorry, it should be Hyderabad. Yes, annexation of Hyderabad, not Andhra. There. First of all, we did not have an army to speak about. That is number one, okay? Even then, much of the army was still run by the British. On both sides, there were British generals, British officials in the army. So that's another important fact, right? Stephen Wilkinson has written a wonderful book called Army and Nation. Again, a very recent book. So this is part of the problem when we talk about Nehru, right? There is no comprehensive biography of Nehru, or there is no comprehensive history of the Nehru era. So if you have to take topics in the Nehru era, how was the military? How was Kashmir? You have to go to each of those books to understand what was the real situation there. So when we say, couldn't we have captured Kashmir, right? First of all, these British generals refused to fight against each other. So that's the other thing. And another point is, even into the China war, right, by the time the British generals mostly had left, other than Timmayya, no one had combat experience. No one had combat experience. That was also a big handicap. Many times the military made fancy claims about what they could do. Nehru was literally holding on to reality there. Srinath Raghavan's book on modern wars of India, which literally covers the Nehru years, the accession of Junagadh, the annexation of Hyderabad, Kashmir, all of those are captured in Srinath Raghavan's book pretty admirably. It is not a sweeping, again, this was one of Raghavan's early books. So it's a pretty slim book. It's not a comprehensive history still. With that, he has captured a lot of information there that was not previously known. Like you wouldn't find much of the information in Sarvapalli Gopal's biography or M.J. Akbar's biography, right? So, and again, when I read Wilkinson's book on how independent India dealt with the army, that's important. Why did the army have such a clout in Pakistan? Why was the army subject to civilian leadership in India? Pre-independence, I can't think of any other liberation movement that prepared themselves for governing, in reality and theoretically, by running provincial governments and by having research papers and policy papers. The Congress was getting ready for governance in a way that I can't think of any other liberation movement did. What to do without what to do about the army in a post-independence era was again thought through. Okay, and the first thing that Nehru and the Congress leadership in general, again, when I say Nehru, much of what Nehru did would not have been possible without Patel and the senior leadership signing on to it, right? So it's not like Nehru was a dictator, Nehru was not running everything. Without Patel's support, much of what Nehru did would not have been possible, particularly until 1950 when Patel died. So the first thing that Nehru does, as soon as he takes over as prime minister, is he occupies Teen Murti Bhavan, which used to be the commander-in-chief's office or home. So essentially, they were telling the military in no uncertain terms, you are subservient to civilian leadership. And until then, the military leadership was part of cabinet decisions, and they were also part of cabinet deliberations, right? But to fire Douglas MacArthur was a big deal for Truman. Cariappa was issuing statements one after another which were counter to civilian leadership and democratic spirit. Again, I'll always say Nehru and Patel, if they had flinched, and they stopped at Cariappa. Yes, ABR, some of those things, right? We have to come to Ambedkar's views on foreign policy on a different day completely. But by and large, again, the Cold War era history is now recently published. Nehru's foreign policy was pretty much, it yielded fruits. If you just looked at the foreign investment in India, that was unbelievable. It was just unbelievable. Without which, it was like if you took the 1957, Eisenhower really studies India's 5-year plan. His administration studies it. And they find that India has a funding problem, right? There's a gap, there's a budget gap. The estimate of America is nearly 700 million. And I think US releases somewhere close to 300 million at that time. And Eisenhower then calls on a consortium of Western Europe and to fund India's budget deficit. This irritated Pakistan. Again, we have to remember this was always Pakistan and India were seen as binaries by the world superpowers. And Pakistan was always a concern whenever America decided to give aid to India. Whenever Soviet Russia gave aid to India, Pakistan will be immediately banging on their doors saying, don't give aid to India. Because in Pakistan's mind, any aid to India makes India stronger, which means India becomes even stronger militarily and economically, which they didn't want. There was no chess piece that could have moved so easily. Particularly coming to the China war, right? Indo-China war. Again, another recent book about what happened in Tibet shows us that. This was written by a ex-CIA analyst and a Brookings Institution person. Number one, this everyone has to understand. Nehru was not naive about communism or China. There is a recorded remark by Nehru to a US ambassador saying there is nothing that scares me more than a nation like China militarized and unified. Nehru knew the belligerent nature of China. And Nehru was not innocent. Nehru was not naive. Nehru was a real student of history. His remarks about communism, communists, and China are pretty on the spot. He was afraid of communism taking over. And in another remark to another US diplomat, again, all of these are minuted, recorded, not like memoirs. These are recorded remarks where he says that he is aware of China's designs and he will not allow China to invade territorially or ideologically. This is important. Nehru is very clear that China might bring communism through the back door into India, through the Communist Party. India's Communist Party irritated China no end. He has called them terrorists. So he knew where they were getting their instructions from. There is a lot of scandal about Chinese funding at that time. And therefore, Nehru was not naive about China's intentions at all in any way. So, and again, it was important. And there is another recorded remark. Again, this is from a recent history book by Mcgar, okay, about the Cold War in South Asia. Nehru is on the record telling an American ambassador, if there is war between the West and Soviet Russia, he will stand with the West. And there is a reason why Nehru says that. Nehru is very clear that liberal democracy is important. He will not accept communism, or the communist totalitarianism was so anathematic to Nehru. And Nehru did not need any lecture from anyone on the dangers of communism. He liked their egalitarian philosophy. Okay, when he talks about communism, he is talking about Marxism that seeks to address income inequality. From the egalitarian aspect is what he picked on Marxism. In every other manner, he spurns communism, particularly their political violence and the anti-violence. Remember, the Stalin purges were just 20 years before Nehru comes to power, right? 1930s. So the Stalinist purges were very well known by Nehru. It's not like he was innocent. So when everyone says, well, Nehru trusted, and also, again, let me go to this thing about, did Nehru trust China, right? Ask the question differently. You go look at how world leadership does treaties and negotiations, right? That's the important part. Even as the US was negotiating with the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor. And the Japanese, US was barely lucky on December 6th or 7th, 1941. Other than if the factor of luck had not held out for US, the entire Pacific fleet would have been completely demolished by the attack in Pearl Harbor. And why was FDR negotiating with Japanese at that time, right? Japan was belligerent. Japan was already making militaristic moves. And yet, here is America negotiating with Japan, okay? And what about, then there is Neville Chamberlain negotiating with Hitler, the Munich Pact, right? Particularly democracies hate war. Liberal democracies hate war. And at some level, you have to trust the other person will hold out his or her bargain. You cannot conduct international diplomacy with a complete absence of trust. You can have your suspicions. You should have your suspicions. And but at the same time, you cannot conduct international diplomacy taking it that you are negotiating with a crook. And there was no way India could have negotiated anything with China without taking into account some element of trust or something that they could do that. And it's interesting that PAK quotes an American president, trust but verify. And again, we lacked the means also, right? We lacked the means. We were a very poor country, very poor. Nehru was more focused on solving famines, the industrial development of India. India could not afford to keep watching its back, right? When I think it was Teddy Roosevelt or Reagan who said, trust but verify. But by the time US was a phenomenal superpower, they could afford that trust but verify. India could not afford it, right? And again, when you look at the recent history that is tumbling out, right? What was happening in Tibet? A CIA-fueled insurgency was going on in Tibet. It was literally CIA-fueled, and particularly it started in the Eisenhower era. And there was the U-2 flights that were going over, and there was a U-2 Gary Powers incident. All of this is happening between the years 1960, 61, and 62. This should be remembered by us, that the world was undergoing a big change at that time. And I have the chronology here actually noted. 1959, the Dalai Lama seeks refuge. 61, Gary Powers is captured and in Soviet Russia at that time, because he was flying a reconnaissance flight. And look at that, right? The US was flying a spy plane over Soviet Russia at that time. And this is another curious factor. Soviet Russia and US later came to an agreement about spy flights in order to avoid war. And then 1961, Kennedy is president. Kennedy is invading Cuba, the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was a complete disaster. Khrushchev starts supplying Cuba. Meantime, the CIA is active in Tibet, and China runs over Tibet. So in 1962, early 1962, and yes, CIA operated from Dhaka also. And that was the other leverage Pakistan had over India, aid for India, right? When we say, oh, why not India become US allied or take aid from US? The strategic location that Pakistan gave, India was not in that same position. It's mere geography. We saw this during 9/11, right? While I think it was the Vajpayee regime at that time, which said, oh, we are ready to do anything the US wants. But what the US needed was an army base to operate from, and in a landlocked area like Afghanistan, Pakistan gave an advantage to US, not India. So as much as we wanted to help the US, mere geography went against us. So 1961, Nehru visits US. This is all happening as a prelude to the war, right? And 1962, the China attack has a corollary that happens. 1962, October 16th, the Cuban Missile Crisis starts. America discovers that Soviet Russia and Khrushchev had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. And Kennedy gets into this 13-day Cuban Missile Crisis. The world is at the brink of a world war. And on October 20th, China marches into Ladakh and the other areas close to the Chinese border. So October 20th, this happens in parallel, right? And literally at some point, India throws up its hands and India literally invites US Army for help. Give us air cover. So a lot of these things were moving around, right? And then Chinese were more intent on making a point. And that's the, here's the part, right? Suddenly on November 20th, China could have just come all through, right? And China stops on November 20th. And suddenly there is a ceasefire. China was more intent on telling India, don't think too much of yourself. And they conveyed that message in a very devastating manner. And it broke Nehru. It literally broke Nehru. And another equation to that is, at that crucial moment, Soviet Russia deserts India. This was an ideological affinity they had with China. That's how Srinath Raghavan puts. But I think at that point, Khrushchev was already facing down Kennedy. And here is China getting into India. Why would Khrushchev now side with India here? Already, US is pouring money into India. So Khrushchev has this part, I don't think came out very well in Raghavan's book, that Khrushchev had no choice but to stand with China. So it was literally three-dimensional chess that was happening. Now, again, coming to the mistakes of Nehru, right? V.K. Krishna Menon. Obviously, that's a big point. By hindsight, right, Krishna Menon was hated by the West. US hated him, UK hated him. Krishna Menon was practically insufferable. The guy was a bloviating person. He thought no end of himself. He was not a good negotiator, and he strutted about. Krishna Menon was a disaster. But again, emerging scholarship, there is a very recent book by Jairam Ramesh on Krishna Menon, which kind of gives a different light on Krishna Menon. I'm yet to read it, and I don't know how good that is, but from the interviews I've seen, there is another side to Krishna Menon that we don't know. So again, this is the problem with the Nehru era. The puzzles are still being filled. It's 50 years, 60 years. We are still filling in the puzzles. And particularly on the India-China war, The Chinese archives are still not accessible for any historian anywhere. So when Neville Maxwell wrote his book and the other Henderson report and everything, India opened up its archives. The Nehru Years, they opened up the archives and said, this is what we did. And the archives were available. But from the Indian side, to know our mistakes, what made the Chinese decision, what drove the Chinese, what was their decision-making process, we don't know. The Chinese archives are still not accessible to any researcher or historian. So people are still looking at the at the India-China war from the perspective of American archives, Western archives, some of the Soviet archives, and India. The key players' archives are still not accessible. And with this incomplete knowledge is what we are judging a key failure of the foreign policy, or a key crisis moment. I wouldn't even call it a failure of the Nehru foreign policy at that point. Remember, foreign policy failures are aplenty, right? England went to war, England went to war after the invasion in Poland. But they finally give Poland to Soviet Russia, right? These are international compulsions. Nobody can, today we can second guess a lot of things from a different perspective. What would be called a real failure is, did they do something despite better knowledge being available? That's a question to be asked. Were there better options? Was there better knowledge? That is a key question, right? We are forming impressions based on incomplete information. They had far more incomplete information, and they were making life and death decisions. Decisions that could have broken up the country, decisions that could have bankrupted the country, decisions that would have cost lives by the thousands. So imperfect decisions is not incompetence. Whether you see it in a corporate atmosphere today or whether you see it in history, you see incomplete decisions. And that's even if you buy an electronic gadget today, all that you can satisfy yourself is, have you looked through some reasonable information? Did you do your research? And on that, if you go by Raghavan's book and a few other corroborating accounts by others, Nehru and others at that, particularly Nehru, questions advice a lot. He doesn't buy into advice that easily. He questions advice a lot. He looks at a 360-degree perspective on the issues. This is something that should be underscored, right? And with all that, maybe he missed something, right? Again, why could he not have fired Krishna Menon? Or when US complained, US officials kept complaining about Krishna Menon for ages. Why was Krishna Menon let to be there in the United Nations or in any capacity as relating to international diplomacy? Krishna Menon was obviously a communist. He was out and out a communist. But on the other hand, Nehru also felt that the imperial colonial powers had still labored under their idea of what India should be, right? So when America and England complains about Krishna Menon, Nehru sees it in a different lens, correct? So just like take Vajpayee's Pokhran decision. Just because America imposed sanctions on India due to that, are we going to say that Vajpayee did something wrong, right? And again, just because a country objects to a diplomat, should the mother country chuck the diplomat? Was Krishna Menon doing something that was nefarious? Was it something that was not policy? Again, he was mostly in line with the policy. The policy was the cabinet's. And the policy was mostly the nation's also, right? If India had moved so much into the US orbit, would Jayaprakash Narayan have accepted it? That's the other thing, right? So, and what was the climate, or a Ram Manohar Lohia sat back and accepted an embrace of US and India? See, when we speak about Krishna Menon, we should remember all this. How much was he acting as a rogue agent? That he was not. Did he have a certain personality? Of course he had. Personalities are always there, right? So when Nehru is almost dying, right? I think Nehru. After Nehru dies, yes, and there was a racial aspect also to some of this, as PAK is pointing out, right? There was a racial aspect, and I'll come to that with respect to the Goa annexation. So let me now go to the Goa annexation a bit, because my train of thought was lost a little here, right? So again, a real good case of three-dimensional chess is the annexation of Goa. Goa was annexed finally in 1961. That is close to 14 years after India became independent. So just think about this for a moment. When we celebrate August 15th, 1947 as India's independence, what we don't realize is the French still had their colonies. The Portuguese were hanging on to Goa. Okay, forget the rest of the princely states that were all creating so many of the problems, which were admirably handled by Patel. And we often forget in the unification of India, a person like B.P. Menon. We assign all credit to Patel. We forget a person like B.P. Menon. So coming to Goa annexation, right? One, Portugal had a treaty with England in 1899. And there was a treaty even before that. So essentially, there is a treaty agreement between England and Portugal to defend Portugal if any attack on its possessions happens. So this treaty is still in force in 1961. By that time, the Brits had left India, but still they have a treaty with Portugal. And here is an added complication. Portugal was also a NATO ally of the US. Okay? So here's a NATO ally, here's an ally of the British, and Portugal was seen as an active defense against international communism. And Nehru was moving against Portugal, a Portuguese colony in Goa. The British wisely kind of played hands-off on this. And they left it mostly to the Americans to deal with Nehru. And now the Americans were making fun of Nehru because, look, you call yourself all this non-violent country and all this, and here you are marching in to a sovereign colony. But little do they realize that they are standing up for a colonial imperialist power for a colony. And within these contradictions, Nehru was moving. And by that time, the Portugal government's colony's treatment of Indians was reaching alarming proportions. There were attacks, brutalities committed. And also, there was a local domestic politics here. By 1961, China was saber-rattling, and Nehru was facing pressure on both counts from Indian population. So, doing an act in Goa relieves some pressure for him. It is also public relations for Nehru. So he strikes, and within a day they get Goa, right? Just that Goa annexation shows us how complicated each and every crisis was. It is not a simple foreign affairs crisis between two parties. There was, each of those crises was, yes, Portugal, I forgot his name, Salazar, I think. Portugal was ruled by a dictator. And that was the other point, right? As PAK says, right? I wish we were doing this in a symposium manner with him along with me. That would have been a really wonderful experience, sir. They were standing up for a dictator. They were standing up for a colonization. And then they were asking Nehru, so now you are not that kind of a saint. Where's your non-alignment? Why are you doing this? So again, the problem is it's not only Nehru who wanted to be seen as idealistic on the global stage. Idealism fuels foreign policy. Without some idealistic or a principled stand, no foreign policy by any nation has been done. We should remember this part. look at the wartime speeches of Churchill. He will repeatedly go at, I am defending freedom. I am defending the Christian civilization. That's in one of his speeches. I am defending the Western world. And I'm defending liberty. And I'm defending freedom. That is the thing. Every foreign policy is wrapped in some principled stand. And Soviet Russia was wrapping its foreign policy equally in some principles. So there is no one who was not holding aloft a banner of principle. So while the West was mocking Nehru, saying, where's your non-alignment, where's your non-violence, they were no saints themselves. They were supporting colonial powers, they were supporting dictators. And even as Churchill was saying, I'm standing for liberty, the guy was so blind that he was keeping in subjugation one half of the world. So such blindness always goes hand in hand. And this is when we look at the Nehru years, right? So I was just thinking about this a few days ago. Take the Modi years, right? We have not faced a foreign policy crisis. Nothing, zero. He is now into his maybe 7th year or the 6th year, a little over 6 years. In 6 years of Modi's regime, there has been no foreign policy crisis, not even remotely close to anything that Nehru faced in his time. In those 17 years, go list out the foreign policy crisis that bedeviled the Nehru administration, right? Starting with Kashmir, starting with the welding of the states. It's one crisis after another. And it was a trapeze act. We needed money, we needed investment, we needed military help. And he was balancing all of this, right? Today, Neelakandan's article speaks about Nehru's visit to Europe in 1938, just before the breakout of the war. And I was reading Rudrangshu Mukherjee's book about Nehru and Bose. There is an interesting meeting that Mukherjee writes. Nehru meets Attlee. Nehru meets Attlee in England in a private manner. And they talk about possible devolution of power from England to India. So the personal equation that Nehru had with world leaders due to his travels, due to who he was, due to his grasp of world history, was phenomenal. And here is a very surprising factoid. So that is also why when Attlee comes to power, he is more predisposed to giving freedom to India, because he understands, one, Britain couldn't afford to hold on to India, and already Nehru was establishing personal relationships. And he always had those. It's not like he was doing it overnight. And this is the other part, right? Nobody else in the Congress was cultivating these kind of relationships on the global stage with the global leadership. It was only Nehru. Again and again and again, you see Nehru establishing relationship with political leaders, with military leaders. He meets Montgomery in one of his visits. And the intellectual leadership. Nehru seeks out intellectual leadership. He's in communication with Einstein. He's in communication with Bernard Shaw. He communicates with Russell. And what does all that mean? I'll come to that in a minute, right? So Nehru's relationship with the global leaders was just fantastic. Here's a little known incident about Nehru and Eisenhower. And Nehru comes for yet another state visit to US when Eisenhower is president now. This is 1951, I think. And by the time, earlier in 1949, Eisenhower had met Nehru as president of Columbia University. Now Eisenhower is meeting Nehru as president. And they meet in Gettysburg. Eisenhower had a home near Gettysburg. They were supposed to meet for an hour or so. That's all. That was the calendar. The US president's meeting with Nehru was supposed to be for an hour or maybe 2. Nehru and Eisenhower spent 8 hours talking. Eisenhower is taken up by Nehru, and he overshoots the time or the schedule, they talk for hours on end. I can't think of any other Indian leader, including his own daughter, who could have done that, right? And if you ask me, okay, then he talked to Eisenhower for 8 hours. What good comes out of it, right? Good came out of it. Eisenhower then starts giving aid in a big way to India. Financial aid starts flowing for India. That personal equation was important. And to some extent, like Chester, the American ambassadors, Chester Bowles, Loy Henderson, were all very taken up by Nehru and Nehru's vision of the world. It's not a personal admiration, right? Why was Chester Bowles, Galbraith, why were they taken up by Nehru? And not because he could quote books, not because he was handsome, or not because he was saying yes to everything America wanted. In fact, he was saying more no. So why were they taken up? Galbraith, Chester Bowles, these were all people who had a worldview that was akin to Nehru's worldview. That is the important part. Nehru's view of a liberal democratic world, largely free of war and focused on development for the people. That is it. That gelled with them. And that is why they had the highest possible respect for Nehru, the access he provides. So Nehru's equations with global leaders, the benefits that came out of that for India in the form of aid, whether it is the investments by Soviet Russia in India's infrastructure, or the Western investment in India's education, cultural association, so on and so forth, right? Just think about it, this one today. The IITs, the Indian Institute of Technology, which particularly if you go to Chennai IIT today, probably you will find the most virulent Nehru-hating crowd today in IIT. Today, India will not create a university with particularly Western collaboration, right? And they will raise all hackles about India's intellectual tradition in Nalanda, and all that nonsense will come out, right? Whereas Nehru deputes a committee to say the simplest Indian citizen should be educated at the cheapest possible expense, at the cost of the exchequer, at the cost of the government, right? That the poorest Indian student must get that education that his father, with his riches, provided him in Cambridge. I have not seen another Indian leader try to educate Indians akin to the educational opportunities that they availed. I will honestly say that it was lastly Nehru. And whether the IITs, and certainly the IITs had a role to play, right? And it's not just the IITs, right? Recently there was a meme about what was the hospital that, any international quality hospital that was created in the last 6 years. Nothing. We still talk about All India Institute of Medical Sciences. That was Nehru's creation, right? And IITs, All India Institute of Medical Sciences. And look at this. The public sector companies, this is brought out in another book that does an economic survey. The public sector companies were all run by bureaucrats. They were not MBA graduates. In fact, India didn't have a management education. No. Don't start off on Arthashastra, Kautilya, and all this nonsense, right? Running a corporation, making management is science, right? MBA. The idea of Indian Institute of Management was in Nehru's era. So you have All India Institute of Medical Sciences, you have Indian Institute of Science, and then you have Indian Institute of Management, and then you have the Indian IITs, and again, diplomats. The Indian Foreign Service was largely his. That was also, there were some elements of it before independence, but he made IFS a career. So, and then And then you look at the network of scientific laboratories, right? A Homi Baba would write to Nehru saying, Bhai, brother. Homi Baba will address Nehru in his letters as Bhai, Jawahar Bhai, my brother. And Nehru's address back to Homi Baba used to be Dear Homi. That was his camaraderie. Nehru, Homi Baba, Vikram Sarabhai, even Meghnad Saha, who later became a bitter opponent of Nehru, and so many other scientists communicated regularly with Nehru. We forget many of this, right? Today in the Indian Science Congress, when we find utter stupidities being spoken about, yes, some of the friends do point out, like, Aravindan, these stupidities get the headlines, but there is work being done elsewhere. But why are these stupidities happening today in the Indian Science Congress, right? It is because of the culture that we have come to today. That culture was not there. There is a wonderful, wonderful letter by Nehru to Indira Gandhi. In 3 pages, Nehru would be highlighting Darwin's theory of evolution, Einstein's theory of relativity, and a few other key theories that were then spoken about. Nehru's understanding of those scientific theories were flawless, absolutely flawless. And he's writing this to a young girl. Okay, Nehru was out and out a man of science. And that we often forget, right? So, whereas now we have a dispensation today that rarely understands science. We promote pseudoscience. And when we talk about Nehru and the scientific establishments, the biggest criticism of Nehru's scientific laboratories came from C.V. Raman. Raman felt that this was government taking over research. This is government putting its feet into research and research institutions. And again, there was some anecdote about Raman throwing the bust of Nehru down and breaking it in anger, etc. was written somewhere. Obviously, I think possibly Swarajya wrote that article. Who else? Right, okay. Did Raman have a point? Yes, Raman has a point about government laboratories, government-run research. But was Raman absolutely correct? No. You go look at the scientific research in American institutions. It is government funded. It is absolutely government funded. From even the large private universities, government funding, American taxpayer money flows into American research. And American research institutions are largely government institutions. They are admirably independent. And that is the thing, right? Did Nehru's laboratories do something at his beck and call? Were they researching cow urine? They were not. Bhatnagar's laboratory, CSIR, they were doing good work. So he was laying all this. And another point to be remembered is, here is a man balancing a crisis, partition on the one hand, economy on the other hand, and international crisis, and yet he is creating these institutions. I don't know if any other leader could have juggled so many balls up in the air at the same time as adroitly as Nehru did. And obviously there is going to be mistakes happening in many of these and parts of these, right? Yes, they're all, at the end of the day, individuals are getting involved, and each of these individuals, like Homi Baba, Vikram Sarabhai, Meghnad Saha, Bhatnagar, they all had their own rivalries. Look, none of these people were fools. They were not naive. They were intellectuals of the highest caliber. And naturally, they had king-size egos also. Even a recent book about AT&T Bell Labs, right? That speaks about, and incidentally, it used to be in New Jersey, which is where America's semiconductor revolution was born. At that time, the US government ensured Bell Labs had a monopoly on telecommunications. Because without that monopoly, if they had been indulging in profit chasing, the amount of attention and the risk taking that they could have done on research would not have been great. Monopoly helped AT&T Bell Labs. This we should kind of think about this a little bit, right? So when we deride government-run institutions, American institutions were no different from what Nehru was actually attempting to do. American research institutions. And again, much of what we blame Nehru for is we are forgetting he was prime minister for 17 years and literally for 14 years, 13 years maybe. I think India's first election was 1951, 1950, we become a republic. So a little over 13 years, 14 years is his period. And managing all this crisis and leaving behind these institutions, if any other liberation struggle had left behind such institutions in such a short time with such challenges. And in all of this, his fingerprints were there. We should remember that. His fingerprints were literally over most of these. It might be somebody else's idea too, right? But why does that somebody think he can go to Nehru and pitch this idea? Is Nehru a Democrat? That's a key question. Yes, he dismissed the Kerala government, and his regime hunted down communists. There was a repressive state at that time, and there were incidents of some banning. At one point, Nehru actually was very irritated with Nirad Babu's autobiography of an unknown Indian. He was very irritated by Nirad Chaudhary's book. And Nirad Chaudhary was pressured in some manner in his job due to all that. But by and large, again, we can pick these incidents. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. Okay? FDR put Japanese American citizens, because they were Japanese, for no other reason, in concentration camps. And yet we call FDR a Democrat. And yet we call Truman or any of these people as Democrats, right? Or even Abraham Lincoln is remembered. And again, there's a wonderful quote. Actually, I came across this quote from Glimpses of World History about Abraham Lincoln from Glimpses of World History, where Lincoln didn't want the war. He was ready to say, if half the country can keep slavery and still be united, I'll be for it. If we all can keep the slaves and be united, I'll be for it. He was getting into the Civil War more to keep the country united, not for banishing slavery. And this is a real quote, and Nehru had that quote. So do we call Abraham Lincoln autocrat today? He was not. And that is the same way. Again, there's another American diplomat who says towards the end of Nehru's years, around 61, 62, there is I think British or an American diplomat records, by and large, India is a democratic country where you can be free to speak your mind. And one of the famous quotes of Nehru is where he tells a cartoonist, do not spare me. Okay. Yes, Nehru had his own prickly ego. Look, you can't be a prime minister and be on the world stage like that and not have some egotistic instinct. There is no saint like that. Gandhi had his ego, Nehru had his ego. So yes, at some point something is going to prick him, and sometimes he might have an outburst here and outburst there. And the communists were very irresponsible at that time, very irresponsible. And they were speaking openly about anarchy. And that is why that repression had to be done. Sheikh Abdullah, the imprisonment of Sheikh Abdullah. Sheikh Abdullah decided to do saber rattling after a point. So again, he had to be imprisoned. So some of this, they were unpleasant choices. And if we looked at his contemporaries, and if we looked at the world even today, by any standard, Nehru's belief in democratic institutions, as PAK aptly puts, was admirable. Here is another thing. He respected the parliament. He absolutely respected the parliament. He always showed up for the question hour. He took great care in answering questions. Here is another democratic tradition that only Nehru started, and I don't know if it was done even by Indira, let alone today. Nehru's letters to the chief ministers. Just read his letters to the chief ministers. Here was a man educating all these chief ministers, many of whom were parochial, very caste-oriented, but he was constantly tutoring them to the point of being irritating also, right? He could also be nauseating, and he could come off as preaching, right? He had that tenor in him. But he was writing, after every international tour, he will write a letter that could be called absolutely executive level communication. Like, imagine a CEO going on a tour and writing to his direct reports. Here's where I went on. Here's what I saw. Here's where we can do something. That is precisely how Nehru wrote these letters. And that is very important to remember. Again, when I say this phrase often important to remember, it is merely to underscore it. I know I'm repeating myself. He was shepherding a nation in democratic institutions. There was dialogue about how far should the Congress party president have a say in the running of the government. And why was he so opposed to P.D. Tandon being a Congress party president? Nothing at that time was more important to Nehru than the image that India was secular. And he felt every gesture should reflect that. Every gesture should reflect that. P.D. Tandon was a fundamentalist. And putting him at the helm of the Congress party was completely anathematic to Nehru. He lost that battle. Patel and Prasad won that battle, but Nehru didn't lose the war. Eventually, he eased out P.D. Tandon. At some point, P.D. Tandon felt it's not worth it, and Tandon left. And for some time, Nehru himself took over the presidency also, Congress presidency also. The democratic norms, he keeps going back. Again, particularly when you see the early days of Prasad and Nehru communicating. Again, Prasad has its less than glorious sides, right? He too was he came close to being a Hindu fundamentalist. But at the same time, they were all also Gandhians at some level. We have to see that part also. We can't brush the congressmen of then just saying they were all Golwalkers. They were not. There is a difference between a Golwalkar and Rajendra Prasad. The Rajendra Prasad, yes sir, I'll come to the Hindu Code Bill shortly. Yes. So they always communicated, right? So they were negotiating a constitution. What were the powers of the presidency? Where does the power of the presidency stop? Where does the power of the prime minister stop? What is the recommendation of the cabinet? When is the president bound by the recommendation of the cabinet? When you go look at the Prasad and Nehru correspondences, were just phenomenal. Again, we have to respect these people merely for that. If any of them had been any less honorable, including Prasad, including Patel, if they had been any less honorable in those crucial early years, India would have morphed into a very different country with very drastic implications. And as P.A. brings up, right, about the Hindu code, and I can't thank you enough, sir, for this, being literally as a wingman, right? So thank you, and I'm privileged. The Hindu code bill, right? I've written this elsewhere. Nehru's piloting of Hindu code bill ranks alongside or even more than the legislative achievement of Lyndon Johnson's civil rights bill. We should understand this. And I know there are people who say, oh, well, the Hindu Code Bill didn't give me that, didn't give me this. We had to get complete women's property rights some 40 years later. You are dealing with an ancient religion, a 5,000-year religious concepts, a tradition that reaches back into the oldest history. And the most continuous also. There have been so many other histories, right? But nothing like Hinduism. Hinduism's biggest strength is that it could claim a historical continuity stretching back into 2-3 millennia easily. No other religion on earth can claim that tradition. It is a moment of pride for anybody who is Hindu or Indian that nobody else can claim that, right? Maybe the Jews can in some manner, yes. But you're dealing with this, and here's the other side of this, right? Sunil Kilnani in his Idea of India points this out, and interestingly, Nehru also points this out in one of his writings. The idea that the ruler and the citizenry can relate through social legislation was completely absent in India, meaning no ruler legislates anything relating to religious belief. This is how, or a reforming belief, right? Whereas in the Western world, those things are very common, okay? Until the Hindu Code Bill happens, the legislative reform of a major religion was unheard of in Indian history. Completely unheard of. Yes, the banning of sati here, the Child Sarada Act for children, against child marriage, so on and so forth, were there, but they were tinkering around the edges. But here is wholesale modification. This is legislation, going into the core of who is a Hindu, what is a Hindu family, how can that family be taxed? This is and what are and how, and again, you're also dealing with the tenets that go back millennia. Can a woman inherit property, right? This is being addressed. And if you look at it, was the Civil Rights Bill 100% good? No. Did everything change in America overnight after the Civil Rights Bill? It did not. It took another nearly 40 years, 50 years, I would say 40, for a black president to happen. And still we see the embers of racism, right? Why is that? Societies can be legislated to some extent. What you see today, what you see as failures today, are not the failures of the Hindu Code Bill. It is the failure of the citizens, not the Hindu Code Bill. And that the Uniform Civil Code is another thing, right? So coming back to the Hindu Code Bill, this was the signal accusation that Ambedkar lays in his resignation speech. Ambedkar says, you guys are dragging your feet. But that is also because in 1946, when the Constituent Assembly proposes Hindu Code Bill, Rajendra Prasad asks a very valid question. He says, is this Constituent Assembly constitutionally empowered for a bill like this? Have we gotten the mandate to do that? And Nehru accepts, yes, the Constituent Assembly's responsibility was drafting the Constitution, not doing a bill like the Hindu Code Bill, which was changing how people lived their religious life. And they take it back. And Nehru campaigns on that bill. Always certain things are mentioned in a manifesto. Was it campaigned upon? Nehru campaigned upon the Hindu Code Bill. The people gave him a mandate. He could claim a mandate for the Hindu Code Bill. And again, you can't pilot a legislation like that overnight and get it approved by a majority of the people who were practicing that faith. Ambedkar lost his patience. That is simply what it was. He simply lost his patience. But Nehru did not. That alone should be, there is a book that deals with it in part, right? Whereas we know exactly how Lyndon Johnson piloted the Civil Rights Bill. There are books about it. Robert Caro has done phenomenal research on it. How Johnson threatened senators, how he cajoled senators, how he got the vote for Civil Rights Bill. Again, he was dealing with a prejudice of a different kind, a prejudice that goes back hundreds of years. And like that, Nehru shepherded the Hindu Code Bill. It became the foundation for later improvements. Yes, improvements were needed. There is no legislation that is going to be good for all time to come. It is impossible. A legislation can address some level of injustice, a prime injustice. And has it succeeded in that? The notion of women's property rights became enshrined. That women are entitled for property rights became enshrined, and it became a goal. So women getting complete property rights happens recently. Okay, this is all more a failure of the Indian citizenry than of the Hindu Code Bill itself. And again, we stick on to these things about oh well, they were too slow. They were all casteist. They were upper caste. They were fundamentalists. You got to deal with the country that you have, right? You can't change the country overnight. And Nehru and Gandhi were very clear they were not for revolutions happening overnight. Incrementalism delivers more results better with far less bloodshed and in a more endurable manner. Incrementalism is often looked down upon, but revolutions have their limit. Revolutions leave a bitter taste. And who knows, if a bill had been rammed through the sessions, let us say they had put together some kind of a majority and passed it overnight or whatever, somebody else with a different majority would have undone it so easily, right? So how was it done? That is the thing. And now somebody else is asking about the linguistic basis of the reorganization of the states. This is another thing, right? So country becomes free, a refugee crisis, economy in crisis, and yet scientific institutions being created, and educational institutions being created, infrastructure being created, and in the midst of this, the entire country is being reorganized cartographically. If that alone, if it had been attempted in Europe, there would have been a lot of bloodshed. Again, the Congress had already thought ahead of time about how to deal with linguistic basis for the states. So why did they dither when they had the power finally? Because of what they saw during partition. There was no stomach for any more vivisection of the country. At some level, it also went against Nehru's instinct. Okay, he's like, are we that parochial that I can't live next to a Malayali or a Telugu-speaking person? The effect of partition, the bloodletting during partition, made Nehru and Prasad and others kind of pull back on reorganizing the states quickly. But the swell of public opinion and the fact that this is something that India wants was understood. And eventually the states were reorganized. And Swaminarayan is asking a good question about, he's asking, in democracy, could something be called failure of citizenry? Yes, of course, right? We're presenting the constitution, I think it was Ambedkar who said, we have given ourselves a constitution. The constitution will not fail us. We will fail the constitution, which means we the citizens. And that includes the legislators. Legislators are citizens too, right? So we fail the constitution. The constitution doesn't fail us. What's the point? So those are the broad points that I had in mind. Any other questions that anybody else has? We could take on questions more now. Yes, somebody else asked about the backward class commission, right? Again, there were enough and more safeguards, including reservation, in the Constitution when Ambedkar was part of the Constitutional Committee and when he was leading it, and as law minister, he does everything. But he feels it was insufficient. And he also makes a point, why is Nehru focused on Muslims and not on scheduled caste and scheduled tribe? Ambedkar says, I'm not against having an attention on Muslims, but why this amount of, he almost says, obsession about Muslims, right? Venkatragavan, there is not, I'll answer your question later. But the obsession about keeping the Muslims safe, the obsession about Muslims feeling safe, that they have a place in independent India, was merely because of the scale of bloodletting that happened during partition. And Nehru felt that it was his responsibility to ensure that Muslims felt that they were part of this country and they are not second-class citizens. Given the scale of violence that was unleashed, that level of attention was unavoidable. It was just unavoidable. And again, point here, right? 1963, this is just 1 year before Nehru's death. 1963, there are some riots in the then East Pakistan, what is now Bangladesh. There are some riots, and of course, Hindus were killed. We don't know the numbers, possibly hundreds or a few hundreds. Immediately, reprisal killings start in Calcutta, where hundreds of Muslims were killed in Calcutta, simply because Hindus were being killed in East Pakistan. Reprisal killings. This is another thing that those are very less spoken about. Okay, reprisal killings were the order of the day, and during partition time, in 47, 48, Muslims and Hindus indulged in this. There are no saints here. But after a point, it became Hindu reprisal killings for anything that happened in East Pakistan. And which is also why even today we find a commentary by saying, oh, well, Hindu population in Pakistan has dwindled, whereas the Muslim population in India has gone up. Now, this is a repugnant argument. India should treat its minorities honorably, equally, and safely, because they are your minorities. They are your citizens. How you treat your citizen should not be preconditioned on how some other co-religionist is treated elsewhere. It's almost like saying, how does America treat Indians here, right? Just because something happens in India, should Americans retaliate here? No, that will be repugnant to an American citizen. Whereas we made all these reprisal killings were very normal back then. That is and this is also about the Hyderabad annexation, right? Prior to the annexation, the Razakars are on a rampage. Many Hindus were killed, and that is what propels Nehru and Patel to act, finally saying enough is enough, we got to go in. But once they go in, once the annexation is complete, reprisal killings start. But here is Nehru's problem. Now, because the reprisal killings were done by Hindus, this is now being done hush-hush. Nobody's willing to speak about it. Nobody's willing to stop it. And another book actually talks about this, the 1963 riots in Calcutta. The police will say, oh, well, we don't have enough policemen to stop the riots. At the same time, they were sending 30, 40 policemen to Gymkhana for a horse show. Okay? Then and now, we know that the police in India is hugely communalized. Whether it is religion or whether it is caste, right? Today, certainly the Dalit citizens will feel that, how they have been treated by upper policemen who are not Dalits, right? So the caste and communal character of India's police force is an urgent problem that should be spoken about at a different scale altogether. So those are the problems that Nehru had, and Nehru had to personally intervene and find out what was going on in Hyderabad due to the reprisal killings. We still don't have a detailed study. There are some committee report is there. There are claims about it being exaggerated, whatnot. The fact that something that just happened like 50 years ago, we don't have a detailed history, tells us something about how we maintain history. And actually, we are masters in not recording things. This is not incidental. Actually, the Indian mind is the best in airbrushing history with an agenda. We don't record history so that we don't have to answer for it. We are real masters of that. And somebody else was bringing up about and another recent WhatsApp message about partition, right? Well, Pakistan got too many good things. This was such a lie. The ratio of division was 80-20. So 80% of colonial India came to India, and only 20% went to Pakistan. Actually, Pakistan lost economically in a big way due to partition. This is where the stupidity of Jinnah has to be spoken about. Jinnah was blinded by fanaticism and egomaniacal nature that he didn't realize what it would mean for the country to be partitioned. What would they get? Most of the, whether it is steel mills, whether it is banking sector, everything, Pakistan had a raw deal actually. If anything, Pakistan has more complaints about what they got as a result of partition than India did. And the effect of partition is still not understood. Nehru says this somewhere. He says, Indians have not understood the magnitude of the effect on partition. So that is something that we have not done, right? There is only one book that is reasonable about partition, which is Yasmin Khan's The Great Partition, right? It's a very simple book, actually. It's not a magisterial history. It's not comprehensive. It is not sweeping. But it is a reasonable book. It brings all the elements together in a readable manner. It is a book that I would highly recommend. So when we talk about, wow, Nehru stood in the way of Hindu refugees coming in. Nehru didn't stand in the way of refugees coming in. But Nehru had a problem, right? Today when we talk about, oh, well, we should have taken every Hindu from East Pakistan into India. Hindu states, Hindu governors and chief ministers refused to take refugees, or Hindu refugees, or non-Muslim refugees. Refugees had to be imposed on states. This is another part that we don't know much about. Many of the states refused to have the refugees come in. Why? Refugees are a problem, a socio-economic problem. Refugees don't just come in with a job. Refugees don't come with money. Some do, most don't. And refugees also come carrying tales of anger, wanting to take vengeance. The emotions are running high. Every refugee who came into India, every refugee who went into Pakistan took with them exaggerated tales about violence, inflaming local population. So imagine 1,000 Hindu refugees coming in and they carry stories, some true, some not true, some exaggerated, some not exaggerated. And the local population looks at the next Muslim on the street as the enemy. And likewise, it happened in Pakistan also. So again, no saints anywhere, right? The refugee problem, the partition problem created a socio-economic crisis that is still not understood properly. The economic impact, and again, India didn't have money. With all that, we were meeting this huge refugee crisis because US and Russia were looking at Western Europe. They were dividing the spoils of war, right? At that time, Marshall Plan was pouring money into Western Europe. Herbert Hoover, after the First World War, etc., he was more focused on refugees in Western Europe and Eastern Europe. So we didn't have help to deal with all this crisis. We did not have any help to deal with the crisis. India, and this is why Stanley Walpert admirably calls the British leaving India as shameful flight. That's what he calls it. Shameful flight. It was hurriedly done. They just packed their bags and went out, and they left us to deal with the whole thing. Yeah, Mountbatten was another megalomaniacal character, another egomaniacal character. Now, if there is something that Nehru could have done different, here is one. Mountbatten should not have been made the first Governor General. We should have kicked him out. The man was just consumed by himself. But I'll also warn this: the retaining of Mountbatten had nothing to do with Edwina, absolutely nothing to do with Edwina at that point. So we have to be clear about that. Okay. And another part about partition that we don't know much about is, for a long time, Britishers continued to remain in the country in many capacities. Only coming close to the 60s where the Britishers really leaving India, whether it was running companies, whether it was running clubs, in the army, in so many capacities, British lingered on for nearly 15 years after independence, 15 years after independence, easily. Again, right, 300 years, 400-year history. You don't erase that overnight. It's not like we make them pack their bags and go overnight. So that didn't happen either. It's not just Mountbatten. The Gymkhana Club was very racist even then. And they didn't allow Indians into the club. And there is a very good incident. So America sends as a goodwill, I think, a Vietnamese athlete or swimmer. He's a Vietnamese Olympic swimmer. Okay, he is coming in as a goodwill visit in Calcutta. The Gymkhana Club refuses admission. So the U.S. consulate asks permission from the club. I don't know if it's Gymkhana or another club, but it is a British-run club. They ask them permission to host an event where the swimmer can swim and show his Indian audience. They refuse because they didn't want Indians in the first place inside the club. And this is after independence. And they also raise the point, by the way, we can't allow this guy because he is also of Asian descent. This was happening in India at that time. And on a related point, right, part of the reason why India could not so readily ally with the US was the racial aspect of US also. US in the 50s and 60s was the Jim Crow US. The racial disparity, the racial aspects of US domestic life troubled Nehru a lot, and not just Nehru, it troubled a lot of people. So becoming an ally of the US, becoming an ally of Truman administration, or even an Eisenhower administration was very difficult for them, right? To swallow that and look at how blacks had been treated in America was a point. So the element of moral element was always there. Now I'll shift a little bit to the economy because somebody else asked about whether Nehru was a socialist. Nehru used that label himself, that he was a socialist, right? But Nehru used it more as a label, not as a philosophy, and he didn't... The economy was more private than we think it was. Nothing was nationalized blindly. Those things happened much later under Indira. Okay, some of them actually benefited, right? Without, many of the nationalized banks, much of the current economic policy may not be possible, right? So we forget that. Indira's nationalization of banks, while we can call it nationalization, communism, socialism, whatever it is, those nationalized banks are the backbone of the current economic policy choices that this regime is making. So, number one, nationalization. They didn't have the money to nationalize many industries. No. Nationalization of the vacuum was the phrase that Nehru used. Where there was no private industry, they would get in. And yes, the airlines were nationalized, which was from JRD Tata. Right? India nationalized airlines. Okay. But again, now come and look at the US. US did not liberalize air travel until the 80s. So the deregulation of air travel happens in the US only in the 80s. So if you look at the economic scene of the world at that time, the Indian choices were not out of line with even what was done in the US. Keynesian economics was predominant. Coming out of the World War, the government is the last lender of resort, right? Government has the money, government can be the backstop for everything. It is done even today. 2008 financial crisis, the US saw a nationalization of the largest insurance company of the world, AIG. Overnight, it was nationalized, literally nationalized. We don't use that term, but AIG was nationalized. This in 2008. A country with such an advanced market structure like the United States had to take over all these companies, invest in them directly, invest taxpayer money. And now come and look at the Nehru era. You would see that it was completely in line. And yes, as PAK points, yes, the thing about the US tax rate being at 80%, but also rarely people actually paid the 80% due to the loopholes, which is the other point. But yes, the US had a very punitive tax rate on the rich. So if you look at all that, the economic policy of the Nehru era lines up right against what FDR and later Truman and Eisenhower was doing. Okay? Kennedy called private sector people bastards. Okay, so the railing against the corporate chiefs was not unknown. Okay, corporate greed was real, and they were standing in the way of progress also. So the economic policy, the 5-year planning, while the inspiration was certainly Soviet Russia, right? The 5-year plans were inspired by Soviet Russia. That doesn't make it communist, right? You could be inspired by a thought that comes from even somewhere else that is so dishonorable, right? But what do you do with that idea is what is important. So what did Nehru do with that 5-year plan idea that he borrows from Soviet Russia, right? He is not nationalizing industries like Lenin and Stalin. He is not taking over all of private production into his hands. Nehru doesn't do that. And first of all, they didn't have the money to do that. On the other hand, again, right, this is where the partition angle again becomes relevant. The centralization of the economy, Yasmin Khan drives this point in a place. Again, she's writing a very broad 10,000 feet history. So she doesn't burrow into it in a big way. And this is where we lack good histories that we still don't have. Again, writing history of economics is another art. Not every historian can write economic history. That's another art. When we talk about India should have done import substitution, India should have followed the South Korea model, India should have followed Singapore model. India is India. India could not do what Singapore does and South Korea does. We are a different country, a very complex country, a very big country, dealing with a very different set of problems. You should look at that era with more admiration about how they were shaping solutions, keeping the Indian reality in mind. And B.R. Nanda, in one of his books about Nehru era, addresses some of these in topics. And coming to a 5-year plan, Nanda gives very good information about how many Western economists were involved in the planning process. Western economic models were used, and Western economists were involved in a big way. So it's not like some Marxist fellows were writing the economic policy. And the other unfortunate aspect also is because, and Jagdish Bhagwati accepts this in a later interview, that many of the economists at that point were leftists, right? Coming out of the London School of Economics, or many of the European economists were leftists at that time. So if you are looking for a Milton Friedman style of economy or economic outlook, there was no Milton Friedman at that time. So we are trying to look back at things in a very different way. What was done between 1947 and 67 worked. And just look at a simple parameter. the longevity of the lifespan of the average Indian, right? It literally increases by 10 years. So between 1947, when Nehru takes over, and when Nehru dies, the average lifespan of an Indian increases by 10 years. That is an achievement anybody would be proud of in a liberal democracy. The statistics on the use of fertilizers, the land that was tilled, that was brought under farming, and I even have some of the statistics here, and the allocation, right? It's an absolute canard to say that agriculture was overlooked. Nearly 20% of the outlay was agriculture. And then there was, and this is all still being done despite the defense expenditure that India did not want to do. Nehru didn't want to spend on the army. On the one hand, there is Ambedkar saying you're spending too much on the army. And then there is, on the other hand, another group saying you're spending too little on the army. So either he's doing something right or he's doing something wrong. He can't be doing both at the same time. Okay? So either he was spending too much on the army or he was spending too little on the army. But that was not the case. Everything was more calibrated. And in 1957, a huge crisis comes up because we were a very monsoon-dependent country. Monsoon, famines were a big problem. And also, again, the economy, right? When you have so many private sector companies operating, and if the private sector companies wanted to bring in foreign investment, just think about this. If private companies were forming foreign collaborations, that is outflow of foreign exchange India simply could not afford at that time. So when we throw words like it was a socialist economy, it was communist, it was a license permit Raj, we are not looking at the complexities of the era fully. And we pick phrases from, here is what Rajaji said, here is what Arvind Panagaria wrote in a book, here is what so-and-so wrote in some memoir. But if you move away from all that and you delve into the complexity of the era, it is amazing as to what they accomplished at the end of the day. That is something that I will give him, right? So, and the stability, right? So in 1967, even today, right? Like I'll go to this extent. When George Bush won the presidency in 2000, okay, and everyone knows the story of how George Bush won the presidency. The U.S. Supreme Court stops the counting in Florida, and he gets the presidency. Time magazine, in its editorial, said, "This is American democracy at its best. We do not see army tanks in the streets. And we are handing over power from one president to another in a peaceful manner." If this is what a 200-year-old democracy can say of itself in 2000, in 1967, power transfers from Nehru to Shastri without a single bullet being fired anywhere. That was Nehru's contribution. That was Nehru's achievement, and so many others also, right? But he was the figurehead of that achievement. He did not promote Indira Gandhi. Like I said, he could have created trouble. Nehru could have easily created trouble for Shastri and the succession that he knew was happening. I mean, Nehru knew he was not immortal. So that is the part that we need to understand. Indira was pretty sidelined after the Kerala fiasco. Indira was nowhere in the running. Not even Vijayalakshmi Pandit, his sister, that he did promote Vijayalakshmi Pandit to some extent by giving her ambassadorships. But again, when it came to leading India, he did not put his family at the forefront. It was pretty much ready for Shastri to take over with little or no interruption. When we talk about planned economy and all this, we need to be careful about what are we quoting. Again and again, I'll come to this. This is a sickness that I almost see, that people tend to quote snatches from here and there, just because it serves a certain viewpoint. What are the facts? Number one, contextualize the facts and contextualize the time period. Like today, again, Neelakandan's article talks about family planning almost like as if it was a eugenics program. If there is a fair criticism of the Nehru era, it is the underestimation that the Nehru years did, particularly Nehru and Mahalanobis, about the population growth. The population was growing more rapidly than they expected, which created the problem in the first place. And Sushila Nair, who was the health minister, she is the one who comes out with the family planning. Time magazine has a small blurb on Sushila Nair complimenting her for family planning. Again, just talking about contraceptives amongst Indian population was revolutionary for that era. And that contributed finally in arresting the population growth to some level. And on this one, there is another canard going about the Muslim growth rate versus the Hindu growth rate. Again, go back to partition. This is again and again, partition is a very less understood event. We have not even understood 1/10 of the echoes of partition, the aftermath of partition, the echoes of partition, as I would call it. US history, right? You can't understand much of US history if you didn't delve into Civil War. Today, if something is happening in a certain part of US, you have to go to Civil War to understand the arc of it. Like that, what did partition accomplish? Partition left behind largely poor Muslims, impoverished Muslims, Muslims who came from the lower caste. They were the ones who were left behind. And poverty and a family size have a correlation. I have seen this even in Tanjavur, where there is a certain people who are in the construction industry. We would call them probably scheduled tribe. They had large families because the larger your family, the more you have an earning member in your family. Okay? So poverty is always linked to large families, lack of nuclear family. Poverty creates so many social issues. And the Muslims, because they are predominantly poor, have paid a price for that. So when you see it from that perspective, we will stop sending these spiteful photographs of a Muslim family, like a 5-member, 6-member Muslim family on a moped. Such spite has to stop. But then we need to understand history for that. And again, a large majority finds it easy to reform itself, right? Unlike a smaller minority that feels threatened. That takes me to secularism, and I'll spend some time on that, and I will kind of wind up with that, right? Why is this near industrial level effort to discredit Nehru? Right? Ever since Advani started the Ram Janmabhoomi movement with the word pseudo-secularism, right? This has been used to discredit the very idea of secularism, okay? There is, I think Goebbels is nothing compared to what happened with the pseudo-secularism propaganda. It was Goebbelsian at a phenomenal scale. Look, there is always, democracy involves appeasement. Appeasement has got many factors. People can be, a candidate can be appeasing on the basis of caste, on the basis of business interests, on the basis of religion, on the basis of language, nationality, ethnicity. Appeasement is at the core of democracy. There is a good and bad side to it because democracy has to respond to the needs and the desires. So when does it become appeasement? When is it responding to a genuine need? That's a wider discussion. Whereas we are having absolutely a horrible understanding of history here and democracy. And Nehru, more than anyone, was completely equidistant from all fundamentalist forces. In Nehru's mind, the Hindu Mahasabha and the Muslim League were one and the same. Absolutely. Nehru did not make any distinction between Hindu Mahasabha and the Muslim League. Again and again and again, he calls the Muslim League communal. His address to Muslim students at the Aligarh Muslim University is stellar. He's blunt. He's blunt, not in the racial stereotyping manner that Patel employed. Nehru says, you are equally citizens and you have a responsibility to be good citizens. And then he actually, in another place, he's irritated by all this thing about, worship times, where Muslims should not be on the megaphone or a Hindu should not be on the megaphone. He's like, guys, you got to live with each other. Compromise. Hindus can't say Muslim can't be on the megaphone, and Muslims can't say that the Hindus can't be leading a bhajan through the street when they are having a worship. You are having a worship inside your mosque. What do you care who's going outside? So he was very equidistant from all communal forces. This is another part that is often not spoken about. He has been harsh on Christian missionaries. Remember, it was under Nehru's period that the Niyogi Commission was formed precisely to probe conversions. Okay? Nehru and Gandhi were harsher on Christian conversions than they were on anything related to Muslims. This is also a fact. Again, this is also because they were facing a strategic choice, right? Muslims, they wanted to make them comfortable because they were facing a very explosive situation. So they were doing a balancing act. And this doesn't mean that the Hindus lost or anyone lost. Far, far from it. Hindus were very well protected then and now. The advantages that Hindus had in so many of these legislations and the educational institutions was phenomenal. Many people would not believe that once upon a time, Madras Christian College used to have separate hostels for Brahmins and non-Brahmins, purely for the vegetarian food and non-vegetarian food. Christian institutions bent backwards to accommodate upper caste Hindus. So this notion of Hindus being under threat is a nefarious propaganda, and this is where it's not Nehru's failure for not making India secular. India failed secularism. India is failing on secularism because increasingly Nehru and Gandhi are being seen as aberrations. This is who we are at the end of the day. But it's up to Indians to say, is this who we are? Can we be different? It is a choice that Indian citizens have to make, and they appear to be making a certain choice today. Whether that will continue in this trajectory, whether that trajectory will change, is the key part that we have to watch for. And my good friend Krishnan Ardhanari brings out this point about Nehru as a good communicator. Yes, Ronald Reagan is called the great communicator in US. I'll say on any given day, Reagan is no patch on Nehru as a communicator. Nehru communicated incessantly with citizens, with cabinet, with the officials of Congress and everyone. So everything was, communication was that is why the selected works of Nehru runs into like close to 680 volumes or so. This is just selected works. Okay, Gandhi, we got the collected works. Collected works of Gandhi runs to 100 volumes, whereas the selected works of Nehru runs into 50 or so, 80 volumes, I think. And actually, the earlier volumes were not that well done. So Nehru as a communicator is another predominant. He communicates on every topic. This is another point we need to pay attention to. He doesn't look down upon the population. As much as he was an intellectual talking to Bernard Shaw or Charlie Chaplin or Einstein, he communicates, whether it is a science congress, whether it is a congress, history congress, whether it is newspaper columns, he communicates incessantly with everyone. And he is communicating ideas. This is the other part. He's not merely communicating. He's communicating ideas. He's articulating ideas. He's articulating policy positions. So when we look at all of this, right, so well, even on the economy, right, everything he explains in the parliament, he uses the parliamentary forum in a very effective manner. He brings, okay, this is what we are doing on economy. Here are my choices. And that's the communication that he does. So if we have to sum up the Nehru era, right, if you look at the institutions, again, I just looked at my notes here again, right, and Bhagwati's book brings this out. Most of the financial institutions, the finance corporations, ICICI, and he names a few of them, it's like an alphabet soup. They were all created in Nehru's era. So when we talk about Nehru as an institution builder, so if we have to sum up his era, right? One, he was an institution builder, where it is Indian Foreign Service, the educational institutions, the institutions for the economy, the institutions for research. You just look at the number of institutions created in the Nehru years and take it from the 90s perhaps. The breathtaking number of institutions that continue to function are phenomenal. That these institutions have fallen in their repute or that they have not produced anything of international ranking is the failure of those institutions and the later generations that came. Right? So this is where India's failure completely rests. And we often mix up all of this and say, well, Nehru failed. No, Nehru didn't fail. Nehru gave the framework. Nehru creates the foundation. He built a house. If you can't keep the house, don't blame Nehru. Right? The house is built. He hands over the house. He dies. We have trashed the house. We have not maintained the house. We have not added to the house. And then we blame the man who built the house. So as an institution builder, as a legislator, he leaves behind a very legislated society. The Constitution. Yes, the Constitution has Ambedkar's leadership on it. But we have to remember, would Ambedkar have been possible without a Gandhi? Gandhi brings Ambedkar into the Constitutional Committee. And then the Constitutional Committee is largely Brahmins. They still yield the place of pride to Ambedkar. We don't remember that part. We often forget the part when we say that the Constitution is upper caste and this and that. Remember, this upper caste dominated Constitutional Committee outlawed untouchability. At a time, outlawed segregation. At a time when the US did not outlaw segregation and any of that, India had outlawed it. And in US, blacks didn't have that much of a voting right as the Dalit had it in the first election. Okay, how important, excuse me, how real was that right given to the Dalits for voting? If you ask that question, yes, in villages they were oppressed. A zamindar can practically tell all his farm hands, don't go vote this way. And again, I'm not implying that all Dalits were farm hands, far from it, right? But again, yes, but the voting right was provided legislatively. There was no adult Indian citizen who did not have a vote in the first election. Adult suffrage, universal suffrage, women had the vote. Everyone had the vote. Everyone who had the age had a vote. This was done by a Constitutional Committee headed by Ambedkar, dominated by Brahmins. We have to give them the credit also, right? So we can't be holding one community responsible for so many problems, and where there are credit due, we can't turn away, right? And they also, the Constitution was progressive, right? reservation was provided for. And many other, even the freedom of religion. This has been circumscribed later. That is because the Supreme Courts and other courts have not held the principle of the Constitution appropriately, right? The freedom to profess and propagate your religion. It's phenomenal that we did that, right? That is important. While that has been circumscribed, while that has been watered down, the Constitution was good. The people failed. That's what happened. The Constitution was good. People failed. When cases go in front of Supreme Court judges or High Court judges who belong to a different community, they rule against the liberty to propagate and convert. Okay? And again, we can't blame the Constitution on this particular aspect. So the Constitution was progressive. And so as an institution builder, as a Democrat, right, he did the other criticism that I think M.O. Mathai, now that's another memoir that is often very notorious. M.O. Mathai's memoir is number 1, pornography, number 2, soft pornography, number 3, yellow journalism, number 4, self-serving, number 5, a litany of facts thrown together. This is all M.O. Mathai's books are, okay? That's all there is in those books. Who slept with whom, who had an affair, all of that is there in salacious details. And because he was a principal secretary or something with Nehru, he naturally has access to some papers and he presents all of that. But it's always like, I heard a gossip here, or this person told me that. Immediately people latch on to those things. And then there is a D.F. Caracas book, The Lotus Eater from Kashmir. Caracas holds Nehru accountable for lack of personal liberty. Okay, the Constitution, when they framed the Constitution, it was possible to arrest people on suspicion. Okay, arresting people on suspicion without a crime being committed, right? Preventive arrests and arrest on suspicion was allowed. Now, should that blame be on Nehru's feet or on the Constitutional Committee's feet? Right? Why should Nehru be held responsible for that? If anything, the Nehru often intervenes in the constitutional debates in favor of personal liberty. Okay, Patel and others were very hawks. Personal liberty was more a nicety for Patel and others. With Nehru, it's an article of faith. So Nehru often intervenes in the constitutional debates. And possibly Ambedkar. I have not read the debates. Possibly someone like A.B. Rajsekaran or G.K. Ramurthy might be able to say more. Personal liberty is still not well understood in the Indian context. Okay, that is why India does not have the equivalent of the Bill of Rights that America had. And actually, this is there in Granville Austin's book, right? They actually look at Ambedkar and others look at the American Constitution also, and they reason out, oh well, you had the Bill of Rights, but in reality, it did not matter much because the blacks didn't have much of those rights. So what is the use of those Bill of Rights that you make such a pride of and that you feel so proud about? And therefore, they really didn't bother with the Bill of Rights. But if India had had something like the Bill of Rights, much of the abuses that we saw from the legal machinery and some of the other things like police excesses, that would not have happened. But that is not Nehru's blame alone. And again, they were forming a country, the likes of which had never existed before in human history. Never before in human history have we found this kind of people, heterogeneous. Yes, we had largely they had a cultural unity and all. Was India before 1947? Yes and no is the answer. Can we say there was no such thing as India before 1947? That is stupidity. There was a cultural unity. But at the same time, was that India the India of 1947? That also is no. It's almost like saying like a French Christian and an English Christian, they have some shared heritage. But does that mean that a French and a English guy, England can be one country? No. So a Kashmiri Brahmin and a Tamil Brahmin had little in common, and they had something in common. So where do you draw the line, right? So linguistic, ethnic, and so many of this heterogeneity, it scared people. If you go and read Ambedkar's thoughts on Pakistan, he comes round and round to this idea of heterogeneity. The idea of a nation as it was then by the Western authors was that it should be homogeneous. There should be some homogeneity, linguistic, religion, or ethnicity. These were three big factors, and India was neither. None of this. And with that in mind, when they were framing the Constitution, how far was it possible for them to give absolute freedom? Like, take the First Amendment of the US Bill of Rights, which is one of the most cherished amendment in the US constitutional history. Any American will tell you straight away that he's proud about the First Amendment. The First Amendment, for the first time in human history, says no future legislative assembly will enact a law that will bridge freedom of speech. Essentially, it is a self-limiting provision. So somebody in 18th century is saying, no one in future can undo this, what is being done today. It's phenomenal. But come to a free speech in a country like India, right? What was the big problem during partition riots? Every newspaper functioned literally like cheerleaders for violence. Every newspaper, particularly the Bengali newspapers, they functioned literally, they were warmongers. They were conducting opinion polls on whether India should go to war. It was almost a constant feature. So controlling the news was possible to some extent because India did not have a First Amendment. And again, the 1963 riots that I was referring to, right? It would not have been possible to control that if India had a First Amendment where people were free to publish whatever they wanted to publish. India had a problem. So was India a mature... Again, America had the Bill of Rights, but it still observed more in the breach, right? But a constitution is important because it is in the constitution. Today, there are questions being asked about an arrest. The problem for India is because we lack the Bill of Rights, the police can actually get away with it. Or a repressive state government can get away with it. That is where the constitution framers of India failed. And it is a collective failure. It was not the failure of Nehru alone. So when Karaka makes a big thing about, oh, well, there was this incident in Mumbai, somewhere some police officer beat a crippled man. That was his charge. Nehru is responsible for this tyranny. How is Nehru responsible? And again, Nehru was trying to say, some of these state governments, he's writing to them, don't be so repressive. And he says, I can't interfere beyond a point because it is the state government's constitutional obligation. And Karaka refuses to buy that. He says, oh, well, didn't we hold the colonial viceroy responsible for everything that happened? But a colonial viceroy's relationship with the state government is not the same as Nehru's relationship with a state government. Nehru is functioning under a constitutional framework. The viceroy was not. But to Karaka, who only wants to take pot shots, that doesn't matter. And we use these books often, again, not contextualized and not deep in history to throw mud at Nehru. So if you look at it, right, so where is Nehru's place in history? Again, I'll go back to his contemporaries. Churchill's second outing as a prime minister from 1955, I think, it was a complete disaster. Again, Churchill refused to understand that he was becoming sick and old. And he finally had to quit. He was becoming senile. He was becoming grumpy. He was acting like a child in the parliament. He stuck his tongue out during a debate, I think. And then Clementine Churchill had to scold him. So he was becoming actually senile. So when you look at Churchill, right, a man who had so many disasters in his life, Gallipoli and Dunkirk, so on and so forth. But what does Churchill mean in history? At a crucial moment, he was the only person who saw through Hitler. He was wrong on many things. He was right on the one thing that was important at that point in history. FDR, wrong on many things, right on very important points. Giving hope to a people during Great Depression. I mean, again, we talk about the Indochina War, right? That India was not prepared. Go look at how prepared the US was when Roosevelt declares the day of infamy. The US war preparation was worse than Netherlands. By this time, they were supplying some of the war material to England. Even despite that, the US preparation for World War was pathetic. And that also was because in their zeal to address the Great Depression, they had completely unionized a lot, companies were curtailed, manufacturing was curtailed, and therefore the US industry was not ready for wartime production. That's the important part. So if you look at how prepared was the US, such an industrial powerhouse, when it entered World War, and you look at India's preparedness during the India-China War, then you can contextualize. So, and yet, why is FDR being looked at with such reverence by Americans? He provides hope at a very crucial juncture. And what was his role at that time? Holding the Allies, holding Churchill and Stalin together, supplying the war effort, rallying the nation, taking the war to a level where the war was won by the Allies. So at any point in history, there are key functions that a leader performs. So the first, if we have to round off the Nehru era as an institution builder, democratic institutions, leaving the country stable, addressing some of the intractable economic problems, giving the tools for the subsequent administrations to deal with the problems. It is those tools that Indira Gandhi uses to wipe out food insufficiency. It is those tools that Indira Gandhi uses to become a space power. So on and so forth. And it is those tools that still hold India together. Those educational institutions, the educational curriculums that were put in place. So much was put in place then that we still look back at it and probably we hold him way more responsible than he should be, which is also why our disappointments are more in Nehru, because we hold him more responsible than he really was. Institution builder, democratic institutions, and the secular outlook. If Nehru had flinched one iota, India would have become a Hindu Pakistan. That is a fact. It was Nehru who stood steadfast. That is the one big reason why the Hindutva group today gets their blood pressure up whenever we mention Nehru. Because Nehru was the last court of appeal for all minorities. Minorities understood, as long as Nehru was at the helm, they are safe. And in a way, I can make this point about the Tamil Nadu politics also, right? We still today in Tamil Nadu, they talk about the Hindi imposition. They'll refer to Nehru's promise about the vernacular. Nehru's promise was as good as legislation. It was a promise, but Nehru's promise was as good as legislation. Here was a man who, if he gave a promise, he stood behind it. And he was always for minority rights. And this is not about religious minority alone. When the linguistic reorganization happens, he worries a lot about people who live in the borders of each state, where people have a mixture of languages. And he is very particular that people living in those border areas of each state, those children have the ability to learn whatever their mother tongue is. For example, a Kannadiga speaking person in the border between Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, he writes about the language policy where he says, particularly in the borders, right, the state borders, where there is more mix of languages, he wants to ensure that children get everything they want to learn, the languages they want to learn. He was always thinking about minority, whether it is religious minority, ethnic minority, and any other sense of minority. So, yes, certainly there were failures, and certainly there were things that could have been done different, but when we take a view like McCullough does for Truman or Brands does for Roosevelt, if we take that overarching view of Nehru's era, he continues to be a giant. He is still a giant for whom India is greatly indebted to. And he performed an important function way beyond anyone else had done in that era. With that, we'll close. And thanks for everyone for joining.